This video, this little brat edited it. He used technology to frame my daughter. Betty's shrill scream tore through the thick silence in the living room, her trembling finger pointing straight at the 65-inch TV screen that was playing on loop the scene of her precious daughter casually wading in shallow water, and then directing her own fake near drowning. Around us, the neighbors began quietly setting their glasses down on the glass table, clearing their throats to tell their kids to pack up their things to leave without bothering to utter a single word of goodbye. The suffocating heat of the 4th of July afternoon rose from the asphalt as our family's car turned onto the dirt road leading down to the lakeside vacation cabin in the suburbs of Michigan. I sat with my head slumped against the window in the back seat, staring dejectedly at the passing pine trees. By now, I should have been in Chicago, getting ready for an epic barbecue at my best friend's house with the basketball team. I am turning 16 next month, the age when people start having their own plans for the holidays, instead of being stuffed into the back seat along with countless coolers full of beer and hot dogs. But my dad had decided this would be a family bonding vacation. Bonding, according to my dad's definition, meant I had to endure the presence of Betty, a stepmother who was always drowned in the smell of expensive perfume mixed with alcohol, and Jill, my 15-year-old stepsister who considered the universe to revolve solely around her belly button. As soon as the tires crunched onto the gravel strip in front of the wooden house, Betty turned back to look at me with her usual commanding glare. She pulled a blindingly bright fluorescent orange plastic whistle out of her purse, the kind meant for sports referees, and threw it straight onto my lap. She told me the neighbors were coming over today, and they were bringing about 5 kids under the age of 10. She emphasized that I was the oldest brother here, so I automatically became the unpaid lifeguard and babysitter for that whole bunch of kids. My dad, busy unloading luggage, just grunted in agreement without even glancing at me once. I rolled my eyes and shoved the whistle into my pocket. The backyard area bordering the lake quickly turned into a noisy battlefield. The Henderson family from the house next door dragged themselves over along with a swarm of little kids running wild everywhere. Besides them, there were 3 young guys around 18 or 19 years old. I vaguely heard my dad say they were European exchange students staying with an acquaintance. In their countries, that age was legally allowed to drink, so my dad and Mr. Henderson didn't hesitate to toss them a few cold beers. Those 3 guys sat perched on the wooden railing, blasting music and laughing loudly. Meanwhile, I was stuck in a sandy corner of the yard, holding that blindingly orange whistle, trying to stop a 4-year-old boy from eating mulch and another 6-year-old girl who was intending to throw her mother's tablet into the water. Jill was different. She didn't have to do anything. Even though we were about the same age in Betty's eyes, Jill was always a delicate little princess, fragile and in need of protection. Jill wore a bright red swimsuit, hovering back and forth around the railing area where the European guys were gathering. She kept flipping her hair, giggling loudly, and trying to squeeze her way into their conversation. But those 18-year-olds didn't pay the slightest attention to a 15-year-old brat. They just clinked their glasses, discussed some soccer matches in Germany, and completely ignored Jill. Attention was her lifeblood. If nobody paid attention to her, Jill would create her own drama. Last week, she faked shortness of breath and threatened to run away just because Betty accidentally bought the wrong flavor of ice cream she liked. And today, when her efforts to flirt with those guys failed miserably, I knew for sure she was plotting some stunt. I had to take my eyes off Jill because the Henderson kid was trying to climb onto the slippery edge of the pier. The wind blew hard, carrying the cool moisture from the middle of the lake, mixed with the smell of charred grilled beef rising from my dad's giant charcoal grill. The booming music, the clinking of adults' glasses, and the screaming of children formed a chaotic mess of sound that made my head throb. I let out a loud whistle to call the kid back to the lawn. Right at that moment, I caught a glimpse of Jill sneaking down into the water. The area under the pier was very shallow, only reaching waist-high, surrounded entirely by moss and wooden posts covered in chipped barnacles. She stood hiding behind a large wooden post, her hands gripping tightly onto the crossbeam. I let out a long sigh, a stupid game of hide-and-seek to make everyone frantically look for her. I decided to ignore her. My forced responsibility today was to keep an eye on the kids under 10, not to play mind games with a 15-year-old who loved throwing tantrums. About 15 minutes passed. The adults were still raising their glasses in celebration on the porch area, a wide lawn away from the pier. The guys had moved on to playing water balloon toss. No one had noticed Jill's disappearance. Then, a desperate scream pierced through the noisy atmosphere. It wasn't the broken, water-gurgling cry for help of someone truly struggling. It was a long, shrill, overly dramatic shriek straight out of a cheap soap opera. Everyone startled and turned around. From under the pier, Jill was flailing her arms, splashing water everywhere and screaming tragically. I stood frozen in place, partly out of sheer annoyance, partly because I knew exactly how deep the water was right beneath her feet. Mr. Henderson, the person closest to her who was grilling hot dogs, quickly dropped his meat tongs and rushed to the edge of the pier. He bent down. There was no need to jump into the water. He simply reached out his long arm, grabbed Jill's shoulder, and lifted her out of the water with effortless calm. The lake water lazily flowed past her knees. As soon as her feet touched the wooden planks of the pier, Jill collapsed, coughing theatrically, and started sobbing in heavy gasps. Betty chucked her half-finished cocktail, sprinting frantically from the porch down to the lawn. She threw herself onto her daughter, hugging her tight, stroking her soaking wet hair, her mouth constantly making soothing noises. My dad ran over too, his forehead wrinkled with worry. Surrounded by the adults, Jill looked up with her red, tear-filled eyes, pointing a trembling finger straight at me. She sobbed out a story about how she had slipped. The water had dragged her under the pier. She had to fight a life-or-death struggle there for a long time, screaming herself hoarse while I, the person assigned to watch over everyone's safety, just stood there doing nothing. She spoke between hiccups, perfectly playing the role of a victim who had just escaped the scythe of death. All eyes turned toward me. Fury flared up in my chest. I pointed straight at the underside of the pier, yelling back loudly, insisting that the water down there didn't even reach her belly button, and I knew full well she purposely hid there to get attention because nobody bothered to look her way. I didn't even get to finish my sentence before Betty charged at me. She lunged forward, an arm raised. My dad blocked it. The glass dropped. Glass shards shattered. Everything exploded. She screamed right in my face, her breath reeking of strawberry alcohol. She accused me of being irresponsible, cold-blooded, and attempting murder. "Are you going to let my daughter drown just because of your cheap selfishness, you bastard?" Her shriek overpowered both the music and the wind. I wiped the fishy lake water dripping down my hair off my face, throwing the fluorescent orange plastic whistle onto the wooden floor with a smack. I looked her dead in the eye, enunciating every single word that if she was so good, she should go play babysitter for her own 15-year-old daughter. I was done. My dad stood there, clumsily gripping his wife's shoulders, constantly telling me to be quiet and not say another word. The European guys stood with their arms crossed, watching us like they were enjoying a comedy show. Mr. Henderson awkwardly returned to the grill. Betty ordered me to be grounded. She forbade me from stepping foot out of the attic bedroom for the rest of the holiday. The reason she gave was that I had pushed her daughter to her death. I was escorted up to the attic immediately, leaving behind the booming music that was starting to be turned up again and the fake laughter of the guests. The attic door slammed shut. Locked from the outside, I was locked up in here, in this stuffy, dusty room, all because of a cheap theatrical act. The attic room was sweltering like a furnace. The smell of dry pine dust shot straight up my nose every time I breathed. I violently threw my t-shirt, soaked in sweat and lake water, into the corner of the wall, and slumped down onto the old, bed-bug-ridden mattress. From the single tiny semicircular window on the roof, I could still clearly hear every thumping bass beat of the pop song playing under the porch, the clinking of raised glasses, and the lively laughter that had resumed. They quickly forgot the incident just now. Or rather, they just considered it a dramatic act to add some spice to the holiday. I was the only one who had to pay the price. The outrage boiled in my chest, bitter to the taste. My dad. The man who drove for 4 solid hours from Chicago, forcing me to give up my best friend's party just to bond as a family, didn't utter even half a word to protect me. He chose silence in the face of Betty's irrational fury, exactly the way he had always stayed silent to avoid any conflict ever since moving in with that woman 3 years ago. In their eyes, I was both a free babysitter and a meat shield for the crazy antics of their precious golden daughter. A dry click echoed from outside the door. The brass latch slowly slid to the side. The wooden door creaked open, bringing with it a draft carrying the salty, savory scent of barbecue. I snapped my head up, having prepared a string of curses for Betty if she came up here to continue preaching. But it wasn't Betty. Leaning against the doorframe was Lucas, one of the 3 European guys from earlier. He was wearing floral swim trunks, a tiny action camera hanging around his neck, holding an empty beer bottle in his hand. Lucas shrugged, jerking his chin toward me. He mockingly said that my stepmother was really loud, that she was crying to the neighbors downstairs about me having antisocial personality disorder, and that her daughter would have to go to therapy after today. I scoffed, grabbing the short-sleeved shirt thrown on the back of the chair and hastily putting it on. Lucas didn't answer immediately. He stepped into the room, took the camera off his neck and tossed it toward me. I quickly reached out to catch it. The tiny screen on the back of the camera was lit up, displaying a paused video. Lucas said they were testing the waterproof feature of this camera, the angle placed right on the porch railing. They didn't intend to film my sister, but he told me I should see it for myself. I pressed play. The video was shot from a high angle, covering the entire lawn and pier area. In the frame, the 3 guys were tossing water balloons at each other. But in the left corner of the screen, with every action crystal clear, was Jill. She tiptoed down into the water. The water was crystal clear still, only reaching her thighs. There was no strong current. There was no slipping. Jill stood leaning her back against the wooden post under the pier, her arms crossed over her chest. She stood there for a solid 10 minutes. Occasionally, she peeked her head out to look toward the porch to see if anyone was paying attention. When she realized no one cared, she took a deep breath. She started opening her mouth to scream and slamming her hands against the water, splashing everywhere. My hand gripped the camera so tightly that my knuckles turned pale white. Enough was enough. I shoved Lucas hard to the side, sprinting straight down the steep, narrow wooden stairs. The sound of my footsteps pounded heavily on each step. Lucas let out an amused whistle and leisurely walked behind. The large living room connected to the outdoor porch area was packed with people. Betty was sitting imposingly on the leather sofa in the middle of the room. Jill sat next to her mother, wrapped in a thick wool blanket even though the temperature outside was 30 degrees Celsius. In her hands was a steaming mug of hot cocoa. My dad stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, his face full of endurance. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson and a few other neighbors were standing around, constantly clicking their tongues in pity, casting sympathetic glances toward Betty and her daughter. Betty's shrill voice rang out full of fake melancholy, lamenting that she had tried to love me like her own child, but I always found ways to harm Jill. And the fact that I stood watching the girl sink into the water earlier was just unthinkable. I spoke up in a gruff voice, stepping straight into the middle of their circle. All conversations instantly died down. Betty jumped. She dropped her hand, causing the silver spoon in Jill's cocoa mug to hit the side of the cup, creating a sharp clinking sound. My dad lunged forward, raising his hand to signal. My dad snapped, asking who allowed me to come down here and ordering me to go back to my room immediately. I ignored him. I walked straight up to the giant smart TV hanging on the living room wall, my fingers tapping rapidly on my phone after plugging the memory card from Lucas's camera through a small adapter. I coldly announced that I would go back to my room to pack my things and leave, but first, everyone here had the right to witness the professional-level acting of our family's near-drowning victim. I pressed the button. The TV screen flashed. The video started playing. The sound transmitted through the surround speakers. The camera angle pointed straight down at the lake. Everyone held their breath. Jill slowly waded down. The water was at her thighs. She leaned against the post. She peeked around. She waited. Then she screamed on her own. The entire room sank into a thick silence, so heavy that I could hear the sound of a fly flapping its wings around the chandelier. The video ended, automatically looping back to the beginning. The image of Jill sneaking down into the water with a mischievous look on her face appeared once again on the 65-inch screen. Jill swung her arm, swatting the cocoa mug off her lap. The hot brown liquid splashed all over the expensive white leather sofa. She covered her ears tightly with both hands, curling herself up into a ball, her mouth shrieking meaningless, ear-piercing noises. Betty sprang up to her feet. She pointed her finger at the screen, stammering. She turned to look at Mr. Henderson, then looked at the other neighbors, desperately trying to find the most absurd excuse to blame me for faking the video using technology. Not a single person answered her. Mr. Henderson slowly set his beer can down on the glass table. He cleared his throat, not looking at Betty but turning to pat his wife's shoulder, softly saying it was getting late and their kids needed to go to bed, then excused themselves to leave. The other neighbors also quietly found excuses to retreat. Nobody bothered to say another word of goodbye. They hurriedly gathered their belongings, grabbing their kids by the hand and leaving the house. The music out on the porch had been turned off completely by Lucas at some point. Within just 5 minutes, the living room was wide open and empty, leaving behind only bitter humiliation. My dad stood frozen next to the fireplace. His arms hung down by his sides in a pathetic manner. He slowly turned his head to look at Betty, who was trying to scream and soothe Jill, then shifted his gaze to me. He took a step forward and softly called my name in a hoarse voice. I pulled the memory card out of the TV, tossing it back to Lucas, who was standing whistling in the corner by the door. I didn't wait for my dad to finish his sentence. I walked straight up to the attic, shoved all my soaking wet clothes and personal belongings into my sports backpack. I zipped it up with a forceful yank, slung the backpack over my shoulder, and headed straight downstairs. My dad was standing blocking the main door. He asked me where I was going when it was getting dark and I couldn't catch a ride back to the city. I squeezed past him, pushing the heavy oak door open. I informed him that Lucas's group was getting ready to drive back to the city, and they had agreed to give me a ride. I wished my dad a happy 4th of July holiday with his real family. I stepped down the stone steps, heading straight for the old minivan belonging to Lucas's group that was idling and waiting. I opened the car door, climbed into the back seat, and slammed the door shut. From the back seat, I looked through the window tinted by the sunset. My dad stood quietly on the porch, his shadow casting long across the wooden floor. Behind him was the half-open door leaking the sickly yellow light of the cold living room. The vehicle rolled forward, the sound of the tires crunching gravelly on the dirt, leaving behind the vacation cabin slowly sinking into the darkness. On the distant horizon, a burst of fireworks exploded over the dark surface of the lake.